Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Path of the Autarch by Alexander Layne, narrated by Jonathan Johns. Path of the Autarch 1. Iradan, 5 years later. At the center of the altar of bones, Iradan placed a skull engraved with the name of the man he would kill, Marak. In truth, Iradan knew little about the man, except that he was a usurper, a heretic, a practitioner of forbidden arts, and an enemy of the Ascendancy. Any one of those things was enough to seal his fate. Because he was all of those things, they had summoned Iradan Aman Cestus, Saint of the Green Star. The cleric, face hidden behind a mask of green-tinted bronze, touched Iradan's brow with 2 blood-drenched fingers. He began to paint the mark of the Green Star. The temple, filled with the throat-singing of masked acolytes, seemed to grow suddenly colder. Iradan closed his eyes. He was naked from the waist up, pale, scarred, and tattooed body on full display. His chest and back had already been painted with blood, now dried and crusty. The ritual was almost complete, and then the hunt would be on. "Blessed child of the star," murmured the cleric, "speak to me the name carved into that skull." Iradan had carved the name more than once. He'd carved it a dozen times across the crown of the skull. He'd cut the letters into the hollowed-out eye sockets, into the few teeth that remained, into the length of jawbone. The skull belonged to his grandfather, who had also been a saint, who had died by Iradan's own hand. It was, as such, a holy and venerated artifact. Iradan said, in a whisper, "Marak. And when you come upon the one named Marak," said the cleric, "what will you do?" "In the name of the Green Star, I will bleed him. I will pull his bones apart. I will bring his desecrated remains back here, to this temple, so that they may be dedicated to the ascended Lord above." "Open your eyes, Saint." Iradan opened them. The leering mask came into focus, the metallic surface gleaming with warm light from the candles burning around them. "And what will be the consequence of failure?" "Death," Iradan said simply. "But I will not fail." The cleric nodded, satisfied. "Then you may rise, blessed, and with the knowledge that the Green Star guides you." Blood dripped into Iradan's eyes. He let it. Above the altar of bones, above the corpses of sacrificed men and women pinned to the dark stone wall, freshly bled, was the glowing and jagged sigil of the star. It seemed to squirm beneath his gaze. It whispered into his head. Iradan bowed his head. "Thy will be done." Iradan rode out from the Ascendant City at the head of a crusading host at dawn, 500 heavily armored beetle knights, so called because their armor, fashioned by the master craftsmen of the city, was an iridescent green, so that these men and women appeared to be clad in shimmering carapace, not dissimilar to the beetles that were so populous in the southern reaches of their country. Each beetle knight had with them a slave. Many had 2 or even 3, and some, those who were wealthier or were veterans, had up to a dozen each. These slaves formed up in disciplined lines behind the knights, who all rode tall, heavy war horses. To see so many beetle knights in motion, armor bright and alien beneath the sun, was not something a person ever got used to. Iradan was 24 years old. He was the youngest saint in over a century. He had campaigned against the rising Dominion for 4 years without rest, leading troops into battle and fighting wherever conditions were the bloodiest. All of that, he now felt, had been mere preparation for this. This which would guarantee his own ascension, which would topple the kingdom of Ostromir, which was no longer even really a kingdom, which would bring about the conversion or slaughter of untold heretics, including the one named Marak, who some had begun to call the arch-heretic. "I cannot fail." Beside Iradan rode his older sister. Tall, with long red hair artfully braided, and wearing her own suit of green armor, Ascala sat casually in her saddle, perfectly relaxed, as though what they now did was nothing more than an ordinary outing. She had an axe strapped to either side of her hips, and resting upon her left forearm was a bone hawk, specifically bred to be larger than any other bird of prey, its feathers the bleached off-white color of dried bones. Its talons were akin to small knives, and even sharper. Its eyes were puddles of molten gold, forever flickering about in search of victims. Its name was Malaxis, meaning vicious one, and Ascala was very fond of it. Iradan was far less fond. Ascala had had the bird since she was a child. Iradan had grown up with the thing in their household. He had not forgotten the day it had taken those long, curved talons to his face, and when he tried to cover his face, his hands and arms. He still had the scars. They would never fade. Ascala glanced at him, eyes mischievous. "Are you nervous, brother?" "Not at all," he said, and that was true. He wasn't nervous. He had been only 10 when the bird had attacked and nearly killed him. There had been nothing he could do to stop it then. It had taken several household slaves rushing into the room and pulling it off of him to save his life. But much had changed since he was 10. The Ascendancy, which was said to be the largest and most populous city in the world, began to fade into the distance behind them, its vast black walls becoming a vague, shadowy impression. He was glad to see it dwindle. He'd been back for 6 months, but had grown sick of the place already. The Ascendancy was diseased with endless politicking, petty power struggles, and senseless violence. The god above was not best served at the heart of the city. The Dagger's road stretched ahead as far as he could see, wide and paved. It would deliver them all to the way of Atomir, the closest ascendant city to the constantly shifting border they shared with Ostromir. From there it would not take them long to cross over into enemy territory, but until then they were looking at 2 months of travel by road. 2 long, dull months. Iradan was not a patient man. In fact, patience was not a common virtue amongst his people. He shifted in his saddle. "This man, Marak, tell me about him." Again Ascala glanced at him. "I was wondering when you'd ask." "Wonder no longer." Ascala pursed her lips. "He is like no other man I've ever met. He is single-minded in a way I haven't encountered before. If there was only one path he could follow in order to get what he wanted, and there was a great mountain placed directly along that path, he would dig his way through it, no matter how long it took, even if it meant using his own bare hands." "Is that admiration I hear, sister?" "He has qualities that ought to be admired." And what else?" "He is a fine fighter, capable with the blade. I've seen him slay ascendant warriors and Ostromiran knights alike." A shrug. "Although he is no great prodigy. Before you ask, he would not best you. We would not even come close to doing so. In that regard, you have the advantage." Iradan nodded slowly. "Good to know, but then it never really been in doubt." "Continue." Ascala scowled. "He is ruthless. His heart is cold and strong, and he would not hesitate to destroy any enemy, given the chance." "What about weaknesses?" "He is not particularly personable. People follow him because he radiates power and purpose and confidence, but when it comes to understandable morale and other traditional leadership qualities, he is poorly versed. I always sensed that he did not understand people anywhere near as much as he would have liked. He was often aloof and stuck in his own head. Also, he is arrogant." A grin. "Much like yourself, but somehow even more so. He is, I think, prone to underestimating his foes, and believes that he is destined to succeed, that he does not expect the worst when a more pragmatic person would be well advised to do so." Iradan absorbed this silently. "And then," Ascala said, "there is the matter of his sorcery." And here was the part Iradan was most curious about. He had witnessed sorcerers at work during his years fighting the Dominion. Dominion mages had caused them a great deal of trouble. It only took a few of them to change the course of a battle. The Ascendancy, meanwhile, did not utilize such arcane arts. The knowledge was not known to them, and they did not want to know it. They didn't need it. They had the Green Star. Even still he had heard rumors of Marak's power, and though he was not afraid, it was nonetheless something that he would need to be cautious of. Any practitioner of the forbidden arts was a dangerous foe. In Ostromir they called them Shapers, said a scholar. They have few of them left. Marak killed most during the battle for Aemon. I am given to understand that he is uniquely powerful among Shapers. For instance, he does not need to close his eyes while channeling power, as some others do. Iradan kept his eyes on the road ahead. Is that it? He also has a special sword. A special sword, Iradan echoed. He had, of course, heard of sunlight. There were many stories told about Marak and his infamous blade that could supposedly cut through men in steel plate as though they were made of parchment. I have seen it in action, brother. It is a formidable thing. I'm sure, said Iradan. In truth, he was already bored of hearing about the man. Despite all the tales and exploits, Marak was just that, a man. He was a faithless tyrant, a mortal who had stolen a crown through what amounted to little more than thuggery on a large scale. He would bleed and die like any other man. Iradan would be the one to make him do so. He had seen this in a dream. The green star had shown it to him. 2. Davina. From on top of the walls of Althera, Davina watched Marak's approach. It was incredible, the amount of dust kicked up by an army. It discolored the sky, clouds of the stuff hanging above the marching formations. It didn't look real. To Davina it was proof that armies were unnatural. She suspected that humans were not supposed to gather together in such large numbers, and especially not all under the command of a single individual, an individual who so happened to be her brother. Amara leaned up against the wall. She wore a dress of expensive white silk, contrasted with the belt and jeweling sword at her waist. "Oh dear," Amara murmured. "I can just feel my pockets emptying themselves of coin the closer this army gets." "It's Marak's coin," Davina said, a little sharper than she'd intended. Amara waved a hand. Of course, I know that." She paused. "Although since I manage it all—" Davina kept her eyes on the approaching force. Most of them would camp outside of Althera until they could be adequately garrisoned. Marak, his inner circle, and those companies that had suffered the most during his campaign would enter the city today. Amara, with her help, had spent the last month preparing the city for their arrival. In that time, Davina had learned just how logistically difficult armies were. Difficult at first, anyway. It hadn't taken Davina long to figure out solutions to all the various problems that had been giving Amara headaches. Then, at a certain point, it simply became a matter of manual labor, of writing endless documents and letters, meeting with this person and that one, and ensuring they were all coordinating with one another. But all of that was trivial when you threw enough bodies at the problems. It took an army of clerks to support an army of soldiers. "Ah, there he is," Amara said, and pointed. There indeed, rapidly separating from the host of troops, was a small group of people on horseback, making for the Ashen Gates. The group was formed around an individual, figures gleaming silver and gold armor, the Sun Knights, collecting protectively around a man. Marak. Davina's mouth went dry. Her stomach twisted. It had been 3 years since they'd last seen each other. That had been directly after the second siege of Althera, as it was plainly known. A short, brutal affair that ended when the Loyalists, led by Malatax, the oldest nephew of Kalazar, were broken by the arrival of Lord Izemir Vax. Izemir, with Maya at his side, and at the head of a large force of knights on horseback, crashed into Malatax's army. There had been nowhere for them to run. Marak had led a counterattack from Althera, and, along with Izemir, they'd crushed the enemy between them. Afterward, Marak had promised that the war would be over within a month or two, that there was no one left to oppose him. 3 years later, and Davina could barely remember what he even looked like. The amount of time they'd spent together since he'd first run away from their family home was sorrowfully small. Still, he was here now, having just crushed another rebel army only a 2-week ride out of Althera. Nearly all of Ostromir was united under his rule. The vast majority of citizens considered him the true king, All the loyalist commanders were dead, with the exception of Lord Haramas, who had fled across the border they shared with the Dominion, seeking asylum. Nervous? Amara was watching her. Nervous isn't the word I'd use, Davina said slowly. Then what word would you use? In all honesty, I actually don't know. A part of her was beyond excited to have Marak back. This time he would likely spend some time in Althera. There was much for him to do here, after all, and so they would at last be together. At the same time, Davina was angry that he'd been gone for so long, that for the third time he had abandoned her. It's not his fault, she told herself. He's been tending to matters of the most extreme importance. But no matter how much she tried to justify his actions to herself, the anger, and perhaps even resentment, remained. And what about you? Davina asked. How are you feeling about the return of our king? Amara kept her face perfectly neutral. She was good at that. She could have easily been a master card player, or even an actor. If all the gods weren't long dead, she could have brazenly lied right to their faces, and they'd never have known. Which of course made her a very dangerous woman to have as an enemy. Well, Amara said, we have a lot to discuss. Letters, I'm afraid, simply aren't quite good enough. And of course 3 years is a long time to go without seeing an old friend. I wonder, Davina said, more to herself than anything, how is he feeling about his return? How do you want him to be feeling about it? Davina pursed her lips. No way was she going to answer that. In the nearly 6 years she'd lived in Althera, she and Amara had become very close, and she often thought of the woman as being a sort of older sister. Even still, there were some things Davina didn't feel comfortable sharing with her, or with anyone, for that matter. She did not like to talk about Marak with anyone else. It was simply too complicated. Well, Amara said again, it's good timing is all I'll say. He's needed here. The sun was setting, smears of mandarin and lavender light coloring the horizon. Clouds, appearing so soft that she wished she could touch them, were pulled apart by the gentle wind. Stars were starting to poke through, bright and pretty. And there, in the midst, one particular star, brighter than all the others, and tinged green. Davina waited for Marak in Malor's courtyard, the vast open space just beyond the Ashen Gates, which were now wide open in anticipation of the king's arrival. Davina didn't like the courtyard much. During the siege, the enemy had broken through the gates on 3 separate occasions, and following each breach, a brutal battle had taken place in Malor's courtyard. Thankfully, the enemy had never been able to advance any further. The courtyard was simply too easily defensible, with all sorts of raised, fortified sections, where archers could cut down soldiers as they came forward, and with plenty of choke points where a dozen men could fend off 100. Davina had been here, at the courtyard, during 2 of those breaches. She'd been so desperate to help during the siege, to be of use, that she'd volunteered as a surgeon's assistant. And the things she'd seen. It was remarkable, really, just how much blood there was in a human body, and how quickly it could all come rushing out. Perhaps even more amazing was just how simultaneously durable and fragile people were. During those long and terrible weeks, she'd seen soldiers who died as a result of slipping in a puddle of blood and cracking their skulls against the grey courtyard stones. At the same time, she'd helped tend to a woman who'd had a hand cut off, a sword thrust through her stomach, which had resulted in her intestines partially falling out, and half her face crushed by a mace. Somehow she'd survived, and was, in fact, still alive. Davina had gone to visit her just last month. They shared a very nice cake. Someone started to sound a trumpet. A ripple of what she assumed was excitement went through the courtyard. In attendance were several thousand people, consisting of soldiers, lords and ladies, merchants, knights, clerks, servants, and citizens, who'd come to see what all the fuss was about. Now the first Sun Knights were passing through the Ashen Gates tunnel. They entered Malor's courtyard, their brilliant armor catching the light of the setting sun, their white cloaks muddied and bloodied but somehow still resplendent. One carried a banner displaying Marak's sigil, or, she corrected herself, the sigil that now belonged to all of them, a red fist grasping a white star set against a field of black. 24 Sun Knights came to a stop in the courtyard, fanning out and leaving room between them. Then came Marak, flanked not by his knights, but by Haron on one side and Maya on the other. Marak wore his now infamous helmet, golden like the rest of his armor, with a plume of white horsehair to match his cloak. Across his breastplate a radiant sun had been engraved into the metal, and elsewhere, along his greaves, his vambraces, his shield, were elegant, swirling patterns. And there, at his hip, sunlight. A cheer went up from the thousands gathered. Someone started to chant, "King Marak!" And soon enough all around them had taken up the chant. Davina found that she too had joined in, without consciously thinking to do so. Marak held up his right hand in acknowledgement of the crowd. The cheers grew louder. Haron leaned forward and said something in a low voice, causing the king to laugh, and Maya to scowl. "Make way for the king!" A Sun Knight boomed. Several of them rode forward, clearing a path through the crowd. Marak's head turned. Davina felt his gaze settle upon her. She tried on a smile. And Marak dismounted and pushed a Sun Knight back when the man moved a step in the way and ran toward Davina. Davina darted forward to meet him. She threw her arms around him, body pressed up against the cold metal of his armor. He was a head taller than her, and had grown broader and more muscular since she'd last seen him. She could feel his strength in the way he was holding her. "Sister," he murmured, voice muffled by the helmet. She'd forgotten what his voice sounded like. "Welcome back," she said, pulling away just a little. "Take that helmet off, Marak. I want to see you." With both hands she reached for the edges of the helm, but Marak slid slightly out of range, shook his head. "Later. We need to talk, Dev, and catch up. Go to the palace. Make sure they're preparing the ultimate feast. I'm going to eat everything there is to eat. And wait for me there, yes? I shan't be long." Davina tried to find his eyes behind the narrow slit of his visor. What color were they? What emotion did they hold? But all she could see was darkness. She said without thinking, "Is it over? The war?" She regretted the question immediately. How childish it sounded. It took Marak a moment to answer. When he did, she could tell that he was trying to sound comforting. It didn't work. He said, "I think so, sister. I hope so." Many hours passed before Davina saw her brother again. The feast had already begun. In fact, it had been going on for an hour or so. They simply hadn't been able to wait for the king any longer, and at some point a message had come from Marak to tell them not to wait. He would, he said, be there very soon, once he'd dealt with a minor issue. Now in the antechamber before the king's dining hall, Marak gingerly closed the door behind him, an action laden with guilt. He'd changed out of his armor, and now wore fine cloth dyed in a rich dark red. He had on a pair of leather boots, a belt, attached to which was, as always, sunlight, and atop his head, the crown he'd had fashioned in Amen over 5 years ago. Davina didn't care for any of that. Her attention was reserved solely for his face, which she studied as he turned fully to face her. Marak had changed a lot in 3 years. His hair was long and untamed, falling in dark curls about his head, a loose strand decorating his brow. His eyes were cold and hard. Had they always been so? They were like glittering gemstones set into his skull. His face seemed a little fuller, to match the weight, mostly muscle, that he had gained. A new scar traveled along his jawline, another passed horizontally below his left eye. But all of that was superficial. What Davina noticed the most was the way he was twitching. The twitches were small, subtle, but for her impossible to miss. Intermittently, the muscles in his face spasmed, flickers of indescribable agony twisting his expression for a mere heartbeat before he reset to the cool, commanding demeanor of a king. He had experienced similar twitches when she had last seen him 3 years ago, but they had been much more infrequent, much less noticeable. When she'd asked him about them, he had explained quite hesitantly there was something inside his head. He called it the tormentor. Evidently, things had gotten worse. "Brother!" Davina stepped forward. Marak tried on a smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "Apologies for my lateness, sister. I desperately need to bathe and get changed. I've been on the road for so long that I swear I had 100 layers of filth built up underneath my armor. He winced. Disgusting, I know, but I'm here now. Yes, she thought, but for how long? I'm just glad you're here, she said smoothly. I've never seen such a grand feast. I'm sorry to say that it started some time ago, but there was so much food that I'm sure there's plenty left for you. Marak leaned forward and kissed her cheek. His lips were cold. Years of campaigning have made me a particularly non-fussy eater. Once, did you know, at the siege of Imus, we were forced to eat our own horses, as well as plenty of rats. I must have had 100 of them in total. Just on my own. He grimaced. You wouldn't believe how many rats there are during sieges. It's truly astounding, and trust me, they don't taste all that appealing. Davina stared at him as her heart broke. Just how much had he been forced to see and endure? And the way he spoke of such things now, with almost a smile on his face, as though he were telling funny stories rather than relaying grim anecdotes. Just how much had the last 3 years changed him? They linked arms and walked together into the dining hall. Heads turned. Silence rippled outward as first one conversation, then the next, died out, until the only sound was that of their soft footfalls. The royal dining hall of the godless palace, which had been the seat of the King of Ostromir for centuries, was truly cavernous. Although Davina had dined here more times than she could even count, its splendor hadn't yet worn off on her. You could muster a small army inside the dining hall, which in fact was what had been in mind when it was designed. In the event that enemies ever reached the godless palace, it was here, in the dining hall, that a counter-offensive could be organized. The ceiling was vaulted and painted by the master artist, Kaizen Moore. It had taken him 38 years to complete the mural that depicted the unshackling, the catastrophic wars that eventually resulted in Ostromir and several other nations declaring themselves godless. The result of Kaizen's work was a sprawling display of vivid reds, golds, and blue. The ceiling was so immense and so high up that she could scarcely imagine the amount of detail one could find throughout. So much of it wasn't even perceptible from where the diners sat. The dining table itself was an impressive feat, long enough to seat hundreds, carved of dark, solid oak from across the northern sea. 1,000 candles offered their soft, warm glow. Every inch of the table was covered by a chalice, plate, or bowl. If the hall could fit an army, this table could feed one. Marak made his way to his rightful spot at the end of the table, a spot that hadn't been taken for years now. His chair creaked beneath him as he lowered himself into it. Davina took the spare chair next to him. Marak offered those seated at the table a benevolent smile, ruined a moment later by a twitch that briefly closed his left eye. "It's good to be back," Marak said. His voice was loud and strong. Years of command had shaped it so. Davina found herself captivated by his easy aura of authority. It was Amara, her hair elegantly done up, wearing makeup that exaggerated the contours of her face, who took the initiative. "I think I speak for everyone, my lord, when I say that we are all incredibly glad to have you back. And let me be the first to congratulate you on your ultimate victory. We are, I think, all quite aware of just how much you've had to sacrifice these past few years." Marak looked at her for a long moment. What was that in his eyes? Davina knew that her brother was very fond of the woman who had become like a sister to her. She had been with him since nearly the beginning. "Thank you," Marak said softly. "Everything I've done has been for everyone at this table. I would go so far as to say it's been for every man, woman, and child drawing breath right now, and who are yet to draw breath, because that, my friends, is the true scope of my work. I have not done all of this just so I can wear a crown. I do it for the future of the species." Enthusiastic applause from all around the table. A thrill went through her. She had never ceased believing in her brother's grand vision, the one he'd explained to her the last time they'd seen each other. But she'd be lying if, in his absence, the sheer excitement he'd first roused in her hadn't faded a little. 3 years was a long time after all. "And now," Marak said, "before I eat, I have an announcement or two to make. Don't worry, I'll try to make it brief." And here he gave a little smile The suggested mild laughter would be appropriate. Obediently.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?